Welcome. Thank you for showing up tonight, especially those of you here in person. I know it's almost spring break. I know that it's raining, so it's hard to show up in the evening in the rain, but thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jacqueline Hidalgo. I'm a professor of theology and religious studies here at the University of San Diego. And I want to begin this event by acknowledging that I stand as a grateful guest on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I acknowledge that as a migrant to this land, I am the beneficiary of a long and cruel history of settler colonial violence, land theft, and dehumanization that continues to impact the Native people of this continent and many parts of the world. We offer specific respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands as we gather on these lands to have a conversation about the complex and entangled legacies of colonial relations that cross oceans and continents. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by USD's Department of Theology and Religious Studies, the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies here at USD, and California State University San Bernardino Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds. This event is part of a series of teach-ins about Palestine. The Spring 2025 teach-in on Palestine is organized by a coalition of faculty, staff, and alumni from 6 Southern California universities and colleges. The teach-in provides our communities with a series of educational events from multiple academic and cultural perspectives. Our aim is to create spaces for complex learning, honest reflection, and respectful dialogue that will encourage us to think critically about our relationships to what is taking place in Palestine. And I'm quite grateful to this coalition for their ongoing work, for their interest in inviting this great scholar in particular to speak with us tonight. And I will also want to thank the University of San Diego at large for offering us support. And just to let you know, there are a couple more events planned, one later this month. Tale of Two Occupations, the Kingdom of Hawaii and Palestine, a lecture by Dr. Keanu Sai from the University of Hawaii, which will take place on Thursday, March 27th from 6 to 8 p.m. in the Manchester Auditorium here at USD. And then on April 1st from 12:30 to 2 p.m. in the Learning Commons, we have another lecture, Just Academics, the Ethical Responsibility to End Institutional Complicity in Denying Justice for Palestinians, a lecture by Omar Barghouti. Tonight, I am particularly honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Atalia Omer. She's a Religion, Conflict, and Peace Studies professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and I don't know how to say this, School of Global Affairs. The Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on religion, violence, and peace building, as well as theories and methods in the study of religion. Dr. Omer's publications include Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building from Oxford in 2023, and When Peace Is Not Enough, How the Israeli Peace Camp Thinks About Religion, Nationalism, and Justice from the University of Chicago in 2015, as well as Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness and Solidarity with Palestinians from the University of Chicago in 2019. And I'm excited tonight that she will share some of her ethnographic work in a lecture where you see some of the title up here. We show up because we are Jews, not despite being Jewish, Jews in solidarity with Palestinians. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Omer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you for creating the space, all the co-sponsoring units, and professors for creating the space for this event, for this conversation, but within the broader context of the teachings on Palestine. So it's a really great honor to be here. And I thank all of you who showed up in person in this horrible, horrible weather. I mean, I come from South Bend, Indiana, where we needed to sit in the airplane for an hour to de-ice this morning. So in any case, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight. And so yes, what I'll be talking about will draw on my my findings from the book that was just mentioned, Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, And I will draw on this book my findings from the book, from the ethnographic work, to understand and to reflect on the past 16 months in terms of Jewish mobilization in the US against the genocide in Gaza, and for ceasefire and for related campaigns. So I will focus on the American Jewish context, but I also do a lot of research in Jewish-Israeli context in Palestine. So I just want to kind of telegraph very quickly that if that will be something of interest to you in the conversation, I'll be thrilled to discuss that too. Okay, so this is an image from October of mobilization of Jewish activists in Wall Street, calling out those who profit from war and from genocide, and they come out, and especially since the October 7th and the genocidal attack, the assault that was in its aftermath, the American Jews mobilized very, very explicitly, both as Americans and as Jews, which is something that it's really important to highlight, because there are some distinctions from the previous kind of moments of mobilization that I've documented or learned about as I was doing research for my book on American Jewish Palestine Solidarity Activists, a book that was really motivated by the question of how effective loyalties change, and what kind of sociological mechanisms go into that. So this is a very striking image. This event, this action resulted in many arrests. Hundreds of people were arrested, and of course, arms continue to be shipped to Israel in the service of the genocide and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So yeah, this is just an image, very striking image of one of the arrests from this, and you can see, I mean, kind of showing up on the streets as Jews very explicitly, and really reject somehow with this sign, Jews say divest from Israel, that somehow Jewish safety and security depends on militarizing the Israeli state, a political project. Yeah, this is just another example of mobilization in DC. And so one of the critical motifs that emerged for me in my research very, very quickly is how American Jews that I interviewed had kind of in-depth interviews with over 200 people. I joined many actions, did a lot of participant observation work, including going to Palestine, to the West Bank, to join actions of co-resistance to the occupation. And one important theme that emerged is the resignification of the meaning of the holidays as part of the process of unlearning particular understanding of what it means to be Jewish. And but before I go into some of the more kind of technical dimensions in the book, I want to go to the immediate kind of urgency of the moment. These are images that were taken during Passover, during Pesach. It was actually mobilization of mostly American rabbis who are in the space of Jewish Voice for Peace, or the Rabbinic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace, but also others. But they were also joined by a couple rabbis from Israel, so Jewish Israelis, and and some activists, and really they were motivated to go basically to the gates of Gaza, and because they were really wrestling with how to mark Passover, the Seder, how to mark. Louder? Okay, because I hear myself really loudly. Okay. It's hard to hear you. Sorry. Okay. So one of the points that one of the issues that the rabbis really wrestled with is, okay, because really I'm like extremely loud to myself here. So this is a holiday that is supposed to celebrate, to mark freedom, liberation from oppression, and that felt impossible to mark. That was last year, as the genocide was unfolding, and also we learned at the time of systematic starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, and so and one of the key aspects or key moments in the marking of the holiday of Passover is that anyone who is hungry should come and eat, and we should feed whoever is hungry, which is what the sign says. This goes from the kind of the Seder itself. Let all who are hungry come and eat. And so they staged this kind of symbolic march to the gates of Gaza from the south of Israel, with food, with flour, and of course they were stopped. It was kind of a theater of civil disobedience to the whole like framework and discourse, and they were arrested, and but they're all privileged people, and they were okay. But it felt to them very meaningful to mark the holiday in such a symbolic way, do this action, and also indicate and telegraph very, very clearly that this is not happening in their name, and also reclaim the meaning of the holiday itself. It's about liberation from oppression for everyone, which is a clear motif that you see in the movement. Okay, so this is just another example of how holidays become moments for protest, for challenging the discourse, reclaiming the narrative, reclaiming what it means to be Jewish. And again, many in those seders in the streets or in other contexts of protest, but it's also it's not just protest, it's also actually going through the Seder. And many of my interviewees, and this is before the current moment of genocide, many of my interviewees before, because holidays have become part of the repertoire of protest. Many of them reported that sometimes they felt fully Jewish for the first time in the context of protest. And I spoke to people, engaged with people with different kind of backgrounds in terms of their degree of observance and even education, religious education. So it varies, the reports on how. I mean, for some people it was like for the first time I really learned about the Jewish tradition was in the context of pro-Palestine mobilization, because otherwise it was all about Israel and Zionism. And so you have kind of a spectrum of understanding of what it means to show up as Jews in this context. So in one of the seders, Naomi Klein really kind of spoke very powerfully in ways that resonated with many people, and also resonated with what I've learned from my research that predated, as I said, this mobilization. So I want to actually highlight one thing about it. Because what she does here is a very kind of typical move, take the story and then make it relevant for the moment. So she started by saying, I've been thinking about Moses and his rage when he came down from the mount to find the Israelites worshiping golden calf. And then she kind of unpacks this, and then she calls Zionism a false idol. And this really resonated very strongly with many people in the movement, and also being kind of in touch with what predated the current mobilization, because the current mobilization that was massive almost immediately after the assault on Gaza started. People don't just mobilize and are willing to take a rest overnight. I mean, you have a movement building for a long, long time. So, so this is just connecting to the issue about idolatry, the Zionism as idolatry. This is an image of the main protagonist from the film, Simon Zimmerman, who is also founder of the movement, If Not Now, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But the key, so the film is really kind of captures the name, the title of the film really captures a lot and connects to what Naomi Klein talked about in her kind of reflection meditation on the breaking, idolatry. So the film kind of portrays the stories of two protagonists. As I said, Simon Zimmerman is one of them, and her process of unlearning that actually Judaism is not the same as Zionism, and that while she was educated otherwise to be a critical thinker, to be very successful, to go to the best schools, and to ask questions, which is basically kind of the key point of the Passover of the Seder, for as example, to ask questions. She was not allowed to ask questions, and when she started asking questions, that became a problem, and there was a lot of repression against asking questions that problematized, that interrogated, that, if she asked questions about the occupation, like, what occupation are you talking about? And so the title of the film, Israelism, really captures the the worship of a state, of a political project, and how these young people who are portrayed in the film, how they are wrestling with this, and what does it mean, and what does it mean for them for the first time to actually see Palestinians. And what is interesting about the film is that it's a film that is made by Jews, it's about Jews, American Jews, and then it has faced really intense repression in different universities. Events screening the film were canceled after October 7th, because the film came just a little bit before. But that only generated more and more. The movement grew exponentially in terms of American Jews showing up for interrogating and thinking and asking questions. And that is also true in terms statistically. Every time after every, as you all know, there was a long history of cyclical assaults on Gaza, what Israel very cynically calls mowing the lawn before the current moment. And statistically, you can see how different Jewish organizations that are asking questions about Zionism. So I looked at a broader spectrum, how after every or during every assault, the numbers grew of especially younger Jewish students and others who joined, who started asking questions, who tried to look to find a different space. Okay, so moving on to those images from the encampment. From the encampments last spring, also in Passover, students, I mean, this was a very thrilling moment, really, the encampment in Colombia, that was the first started during Passover, and you saw images of students sitting on the ground and marking the holiday and reading, and there was incredibly interfaith kind of space. And I can also speak from my own experience that I visited at least 2 encampments, what the students called liberated zones, and Jewish students invited me to mark different kind of sacred moments like Kabbalat Shabbat, and it was incredibly meaningful because you saw kind of the diversity in that space and students having one another's back, Muslim students and Jewish students and others. So this is just to say that, I mean, it's not news, but it's important to mark it that the pro-Palestine protest space is full with Jewish people. And it's, I think, only will become stronger. So moving back to the research for the book, as I said, a lot of the work really revolved around challenging, and this is among American Jews, is challenging the elders. Really, I mean, there is a very strong sense of outrage against the teachers, against the institutions, and reclaiming the meaning of the holiday, of the different holidays, whatever they are, and really it is something between a sense of what I call the relationality, the sense of the direct sense of responsibility and even sinfulness. This is why I title my book Days of Awe, which goes to the days when between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where one wonders, what will be my fate? And you don't know, and you wrestle. And in that space, in between binaries, and it's also a lot about, interrogating complicity. So this really, as I was finishing the research and writing the book, this really came to me, that sense of wrestling with a sense of being complicit, but also beyond that, of sinfulness, which is a problematic category, very Christian, but also really connects to the experience of the people, of my interlocutors. But it's so you have that relationality that is very strong, but also another strong force that kind of my findings suggest is that of intersectionality, that and that really opened up as a result of the need for unlearning, which is a word that I did not impose on my interlocutors. This is what they told me. They said we needed to do so much unlearning, to unlearn everything that we were taught. And then recognizing, I mean, in terms of the intersectionality, that the struggle to struggle in the US, to fight in the US against xenophobia and Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism is part of the same struggle. And so you see emerging in the movement for a long time, this sense of the intersectional and the relational. And then you can see how it reflects, for instance, in this Hanukkah celebration. So it's not about the nationalistic message, the Zionist reading of the holiday about sovereignty, but about, well, miracles, the miracles of light, and that it disrupts the nationalist frame of marking the holiday. So moving to a very recent Sukkah Festival of Booth that was dismantled, that was in Chicago. So students put together this structure that signifies not having kind of that in between, not having actually, it's not about the way they interpret the holiday. It's not about ownership, land ownership. It's about that journey in between. When you are completely dependent, you are a sojourner. You depend on nature, on the elements. And of course, they wanted to take the symbol and talk about Palestinian liberation, and also thinking about people in Gaza in tents at the time. This is in October or September. And so what does it mean to like in the earlier Passover action of what does it mean to sit around the table and feast and sing about welcoming the hungry, and then knowing that in your name, a whole population is being systematically starved. So in this case, marking Sukkot, and knowing that all these people are in tents, and their tents are flooding and bombed, and all the atrocities that are associated with that. But this was because it was considered to be dangerous, because the students were considered to be dangerous. It was dismantled. The sukkah was dismantled. It was big kind of just kind of to highlight the the absurdity. Somehow it was deemed dangerous. This is just an example of the kind of reflection that that if not now kind of articulated in relation to this very last Sukkot. This Sukkot, Jews are meant to sit prayerfully beneath our canopy, celebrating the bounty of our harvest. And yet we are unable to shake from our minds the images of Palestinians in Gaza burned alive. That was right after there was a very, very broadly circulated image of people burned alive beneath their canopies, starved of food and medicine by the Israeli military. And so it's through this, to marking those moments and making connection to the complicity and also other connections to the process of rewriting Jewish meaning in this context, through this relationality and intersectionality. And so this is an image of one of the first mobilization after the assault on Gaza started after October 7. And that was really to try to kind of the belief that if you stop business as usual and you make it very annoying for commuters on Friday night in Grand Central Station in New York to travel home, that will make somehow be impactful, and especially showing up to this space as Jews, because presumably it's being done for their safety, for our safety. So this was one of the first mobilization, many arrests, but the arms sale continued, and the discourse about Jewish safety in this particular way also continued. So they did other kind of actions, and here it's really, Statue of Liberty really signifies how the mobilization is mobilization as Jews and as Americans, because our tax money, we are taxpayers, and but also it didn't really make a very significant impact on how things were unfolded and continue to unfold. Another kind of framing that really emerged to the foreground, especially around the time of the first anniversary after October 7th, is this notion of every life a universe. And really illuminating one of the key points that animates the movement, that why my safety is more important than somebody else's safety, why my liberation needs to be on somebody else's subjugation. And so these are the key motifs that really emerge and this is before October 7th, just to explain how come the mobilization was so strong and so sudden. So going to the issue of life and human life and whose lives matter, if not now, as I said, after every kind of cyclical assault on Gaza, you see mobilization. So if not now, started in 2014 when there was assault on Gaza, and of course it builds on the three questions of the ancient Rabbi Hillel. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, who am I? And if not now, when? Which really connotes the sense of urgency. So one of the first actions of if not now was to say the Mourner Kaddish on Palestinian, and just really it highlights kind of the main engine of this movement, recognition of Palestinian lives, and which then generates questioning and deepening of the unlearning of this particular Zionist narrative of Jewish history and Jewish meaning and Jewish safety as well. And so that kind of resulted over time through protests against the elders, against the institutions. I mean, there was a lot of the mobilization was around the birthright trips, what people learn in day schools, what people learn in summer schools, what people learn in the federations, and why they're not allowed to talk about the occupation or ask about the occupation. And yeah, it really kind of generates this kind of slogan, yeah, Jews will not be free until Palestinians are, which is also what we heard from Yuval Avraham in his acceptance speech for the film No Other Land. I'm not, my people will not be free until Basel, his Palestinian friend from Safayata will be free. And so this kind of really dominates the discourse. And also, don't do it in my name. Don't do it in my name. So this leads me to the book, Reimagining Jewish, that it's the Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians. And it's very important, this is why I have the picture of the other kind of discourse that is other kind of critique of Zionism that is Jewish, but is not mobilized by concerns with human rights. This is of the kind of just to use a shorthand, these are critique that comes more with a kind of theological ground, that Zionism is false messianism, and that it needs to be resisted. But the movement that my interlocutors that I engage for the book is a part of a movement that is completely mobilized by, as I said, this relationality and intersectionality, and a sense of being a part of a broader movement for justice that is global, that has to interrogate questions of white supremacy and Orientalism and Islamophobia and feminism, and it's through that space that it also reimagines what it means to be Jewish, as it challenges this kind of Zionist interpretation of being Jewish. So the structure of the book first looks at the kind of the discursive terrain of how the anatomy of Jewish narrative is consolidated and reproduces itself. What are the mechanisms? And then I followed my interlocutors through a variety of methodologies, as I said, looking at how their process of unlearning, which is a word that, again, that they used to describe their process, that often was very, very painful process, very personal. I mean, kind of relinquishing innocence is not easy. And also that also manifested in difficulties of having civil conversations at home with parents. So I try to capture this process. And then also going deeper into something that actually I did not expect at all, to dedicate so much space and time and thought. So it was really, it came from my interlocutors, is examining and interrogating whiteness, because they kept talking about I do this using my white privilege. I kept talking about white privilege and as Jews. And so that really invited a deeper, and of course there are Jews who are not white and are not Ashkenazi and are Black, or but that invited a very interesting process for me, really through the ethnographic work, to see how people wrestle with how Jews, one thinker that you hear a lot about in the spaces is James Baldwin, and of course his essay, how Jews made a choice to become white in America. And so the people, my interlocutors, wrestle with how to make a different kind of moral choice, and what would it mean. And to do that, there was a lot of learning and unlearning of how, Zionism is a European movement that emerged in a particular constellation in Europe that is embedded with all of Europe's ills, including Orientalism, Islamophobia. Settler colonialism, of course, was, not a dirty word, that this is what Europe did. And the early Zionists, used the word colonization, the Office for the Colonization of Palestine, initially. So there was a lot of this kind of interrogation in the movement. So as I said, I was very interested sociologically in understanding the process of how people who were embedded in particular understanding of who they were, of their affective loyalties, what kind of processes went into the shift. And so what I found is that often there were politicization on other issues, so like LGBTQI+, or feminist theory, or neoliberalism, or anti-militarism. Like quite a few people talked about how they mobilized against the invasion, American invasion of Iraq, and they went, they protested, and then they saw a few people standing on the side and with sign about Palestine, and that kind of, all of a sudden it clicked for them, or at least it generated enough curiosity to start reading and talking and make those connections. This is again why I kind of really wanted to highlight the intersectional dimensions. And so you have kind of politicization on other issues, and then you have experience of feeling kind of ethical outrage, that seeing pictures or visiting Israel and seeing human rights violations, or just hearing casual racism. I heard that a lot from Israelis, even cousins, because of course many American Jews are connected to communities in Israel, in Jewish Israeli society, and hearing their cousins very casually say very racist things, which is very ubiquitous in Jewish Israeli society. In fact, sociological studies show that the younger generation is Jewish Israeli are more racist than the older generation. So that kind of like raises questions. Actually getting to know, Palestinians or very kind of diverse populations during college, and going on birthright trips, free trips to Israel. And it so happened that it was 2008 and there was one of those cyclical assaults on Gaza. And you start asking questions because you're a smart kid, you read the news and you ask questions and your guide doesn't want to talk to you about it. So then you go back home or back to college and you start reading, which is like one of my great retired colleagues now, David Courtwright, who was one of the leaders of the in the military against the Vietnam War. He said, when I started reading, when he was drafted, he started reading and said, reading is a very subversive act. And so all of a sudden, people start reading, and again, it's a very, very painful process, because to unlearn, disengage from innocence is difficult. And so one needs to acknowledge that. It's not that Palestinians need to have that labor of acknowledgement, but there is a lot of discussion internally about that. And so part of the process is also, of course, it's always multi-directional. I mean, the unlearning is deepening as a result of going on like solidarity trips, or and also being like experiencing personally being censored and things like that. And so many of my interviewees brought about Rachel Corrie. Do people know her story? Yeah. What?
Oh, the activist who was killed by a bulldozer.
Yes, in 2003, and you know where? Remember where? In Gaza, in Rafah. Yeah, in 2003, almost to the day, March 16th. So she was an activist with the International Solidarity Movement. And many of my interviewees, young people, told me, I heard about Rachel Corrie and I had identified with her. I didn't identify with the bulldozer. So Rachel Corrie really features very centrally, at least with activists of a certain generation, that people who undergone a process of unlearning and really wrestling with this. I mean, they wanted to be Rachel Corrie, not the military, not the bulldozer. So she became one of the an important person in the story. So this is an image of one of the actions that I joined in the West Bank, actually in Masafayata, where the film No Other Land is, it tells a story about Masafayata in the southern hills of Hebron. And so this was an action that was called the Solidarity Action or Co-Resistance Action. I joined the Center for Jewish Nonviolence that brought kind of delegation from mostly the US, but there were other people from like Canada, Australia, some places in Europe, but it was mostly from the US. And we spent a full week assigned to one of the villages, and also we spent some time in occupied East Jerusalem. My group was a group of women because, and really the understanding of solidarity is that you take directives from the Palestinians, but they need what they want. And so there was a demand in one of the villages in Susia for only women to spend some time with the women there and the children and help them with some things that they try to do to avoid the surveillance of the drones, because you cannot build anything, you cannot add anything, you cannot change anything. And you keep hearing the drones constantly, nonstop, above. And so I spent a full week in Susia, and then we did an action that, again, it was act of civil disobedience too, because we kind of basically took over a zone that was declared closed military zone, which is one of the mechanisms by which Israel depopulates Palestinians. One of quite a few methodologies. And so you see in the teacher said end occupation, and in the font it says, well, occupation is not our Judaism, which also points to the fact of it's not only the process, it really captures that the process is not only about, well, this is not me, I want nothing to do with this, not in my name, but it also generates the positive and the constructive aspect of, if this is not my Judaism, then what is my Judaism? And so this is where you have to actually have, to know something, to have knowledge, to bring kind of the interpretive frames to reimagine, which is that it's days of reimagining Jewishness in solidarity with Palestinians. So this process of reimagining of what it means to be Jewish is not something that goes into like some a discourse about authenticity, like what is real Judaism, something outside of that relationality. And this is one of the key points that emerged for me from the book. So I think maybe I'll stop here. I have much more to say, but maybe we can open up for conversation.
Bring up the chairs and
Okay.
take the chair.
I can help get them. Are they behind? I can also just pull them up.
Yeah, they did. I'm also gonna turn off that screen so you're completely back click there. They did a process on that.
Thank you so much. And I'm just gonna try to get the conversation started with some questions. And my apologies, I will also say, as I mentioned to you in my previous job, I taught a couple of your pieces, so it's an honor to be here. And I heard some of your reference to that, your own kind of complication of a big theorist in religion that you do work from.
Yeah.
But thank you for just sharing the images and the stories you shared, because I think that they aren't images that people get to see everywhere. And I was wondering if you might be willing to talk a little bit about, for me, yeah, thank you.
That's for the room and this
one for
the recording.
Okay, all right. Okay, hear me? Okay, great. I was wondering if I had a few questions that I thought maybe would bridge some of what you shared tonight and some things from both Days of Awe as well as your more recent book and just also the present. But I was wondering if you'd actually be willing to just start and talk a little bit about yourself as an ethnographer. Where are you coming from, and how did you get interested in these people's stories and in needing to write this book?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, it's really, thank you for the opportunity to talk about that, because I should really situate myself as an ethnographer. It's funny because my most recent book, which is called Decolonizing Religion Peacefully, was published in July 23, or at least this is when I got my advanced copy. And I just came back from Palestine, And it was the most horrific that I could imagine time in Palestine, Israel. I was with students and a colleague, and for the first time in my life, I saw a pogrom in villages in the West Bank, and it felt like, I just remember feeling, because we talk about the Nakba, the event that happened, but also the Nakba is ongoing through this gradual ethnic cleansing that, of course, after October 7th escalated. But I remember that, so that was June 23, when late June, when I was there, and that I was thinking to myself, and I was talking to my friend and colleague, that this is not ongoing Nakba, this is a Nakba. And that was the West Bank, it wasn't Gaza. Like, we couldn't imagine what will happen just in a few months. And so I was very, very, really, and because I don't live there anymore, but I go quite frequently, and every time I would go, it's just so much worse and so much more horrific, and the level of violence, settlers' violence, but it's completely like, now you don't know who's a settler, who's military, who's, and so I came back to my office and I saw the copy of this decolonizing religion and peace building. I'm like, I didn't have energy for it. Like, I didn't want anything to do with this book. And ever since, I mostly, ever since October 7th, I mostly just, completely, nonstop absorbed in Palestine, Israel, although the decolonizing religion peace building, as I mentioned to you before, has really gave me an opportunity. It's a book that talks about actually it's a critique of the peace building industry, religion and peace building industry, and looking at 2 case studies in Mindanao in the Philippines and Kenya. These are kind of the 2, because I have particular access to those contexts, but really the book is about kind of the industry, how religion participates in depoliticizing communities, but the book, writing the book, researching for the book really allowed me to go deeper into kind of decolonial scholarship that deepened my understanding of Palestine, Israel. And so how did I get to Days of Awe? Is I was very interested in initially trying to understand the role of diasporas, and thinking about so-called homeland or conflicts, and I actually started, I thought, not to only talk to Jewish diasporas. And of course, one of the key issues that is being critiqued and interrogated is that somehow Israel is home and the diaspora is not home. So one of the ways in which Jewishness is reimagined is by reclaiming diasporism, which then makes it different than the kind of work you would see in the context of Palestine, of Jews in Palestine, because they have to figure out, well, how can I be in the space but not be a settler colonial, which is a different kind of, burden. But yeah, so I just started talking to American Jews, and they started telling me the stories of their unlearning, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is I need to put everything aside and really understand this process, which really connects, for me as a scholar of religion, ethics, and politics. It really connects to kind of an issue that I wrestle with. I think that it's kind of like a through line in all my work, which is this notion of critical caretaking. So understanding how, the way to understand, I'm very interested in how religion can connect to transforming violence. But in order to understand that, it cannot be like it's in a simplistic way, again, going into like this discourse of authenticity, or bad religion causes violence and good religion process piece, which is a lot of like, you don't, I mean, there are mountains of like, books that, make this argument essentially. But one needs to understand, within kind of do critique, do this unlearning, do historicize, and which is exactly what kind of my interlocutors really took me through their process of this unlearning and reimagining, which it involves kind of digging into, counter archives also within the tradition. But of course, I came to this like when I did the action in the West Bank with the Jewish, the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. I was the Jewish Israeli, and they were all like not Israeli. And when we did the action, all of a sudden came all those activists, the Jewish Israeli activists came into the space to also participate in the action of core resistance to the occupation. And I want to be with them. I didn't want to be with the people, I was, so there were many moments in the process where I felt very torn, but learned so much from my interlocutors. Yeah, I mean, it's been really, transformative process for me. I definitely became very entangled with the different communities, the protest. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, actually. I'd love even to just hear a little bit more. There was one thread in particular I wanted to pick up on coming from my own interest that I will maybe get to, and that's the sort of idea in the book about prophetic pastiche. But I'm going to turn back to that in a minute, which is more that I think what you kind of conjured here is the way that this sort of challenge of being in the diaspora, laying claims to what is authentic, right? Vis-a-vis being a diasporic subject. And I wonder sort of about your own experience being Israeli, but now having lived and worked in the United States for so many years, what impact does that also have on your own sense of home and homemaking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I never felt really at home, which is not a bad thing. But I mean, I actually really connect to, Edward Said, exile. But I think that I've only kind of over time, I've only deepened my, the process of unlearning Zionism. And even though I thought that, I was incubated in the Israeli peace movement, and like, so my first book is really kind of a critical interrogation of the Israeli peace movement, or the exactly for it's not of which I was a part, as I said, for not really coming to terms or even facing, this is the secular peace movement, for facing its and grappling with its political theology, because Zionism is a political theology, also in its secular modality. This is why you need to go so deeply into understanding Europe. I always tell my students, come to my classes on Palestine, Israel, that yes, you think that you are here for a class in a place in the somewhere in the Middle East, but really it's a class about Europe. So Europe is a project. It's a genocidal project, colonial project, Islamophobic, Orientalist project, and and you need to kind of like tease out what it means when, and I try to tease it out for my students through, readings and films and so forth and poetry. So over time, and engaging more and more with the kind of opportunities that you don't get when you are there, with Palestinians, then the conception of home differs, but and transforms, but I guess over time my sense of responsibility that grew, responsibility for for transforming. I guess I'm more kind of from the discourse, because I'm immersed in Peace Institute, like you have here, Kroc actually, Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. So it's the language is transformative. It's about transformation. So you have to kind of interrogate root causes of violence, and what those root causes are deepen. Like for me, my analysis deepen over time, including looking at epistemic forms of violence and how they influence the political and materiality. But I'm interested in reimagining and transforming, not either or, and not really thinking, I guess, in hard ways about resistance too. But anyway, so I guess because of my my life here is also life as a teacher and a scholar, I feel that because at the very heart there is an epistemic form of violence, my responsibility is as a teacher, as a scholar, to critique. This is the critique part, but also the caretaking, the constructive. Yeah. I'm not sure if it.
Yeah, no, that gives me something else I actually want to ask you about, and then I promise I'd like to get back to the prophetic part. But I wondered if you'd just say more, as you just ended at the point, as a teacher, your responsibility is to critiquing and engaging with that epistemic form of violence. What is the epistemic form of violence, and what are some ways that you try to engage that as a teacher?
Yeah. Well, of course, again, it goes back to Europe. Yes. So I've, for example, in my classes, whatever they are, if it's learning in context or meaning going to Palestine, Israel, or in the classroom, something that is very important for me is to introduce the students to help them understand the construction of this construct of the Judeo-Christian that is so naturalized and seem to be so like, oh yeah, Judeo-Christian civilization, this civilizational discourse, and trace for them how, first of all, the very recent history of it, the 19th century, how, and the racist history of the production of this concept of the Judeo-Christian, and then invite the students into looking, for instance, at the Judeo-Islamic, on the Arab Jews with La Shochat, who of course was corresponded directly with Edward Said. So Edward Said's famous, which I always teach my students, different versions of this essay. Zionism from the perspective of its victims. And then Ella Shochat writes in the same journal, Zionism from the perspective of its Jewish victims, the Arab Jews. And then, invite the students to think about it, to read, memoirs, like Avi Shlein's recent memoir on Three Worlds and his childhood about Iraq, Jews in Iraq. And this already, just for the students, it really disrupts immediately, like, wait a second, it disrupts the kind of the Eurocentricity and also the what this a word that I learned from my interlocutors in the book, Ashken normativity, so Ashkenazi normativity. And so, and this is really, I really learned it from the movement itself. I mean, a lot of theory, of course, comes from, the social movement of centering, queer Jews and feminist discourse and Arab Jews and Black Jews. This is one of the ways in which, but then you kind of trace for the students how, the relationship between knowledge and power. For instance, just this week we read about, I teach a course on Palestine and Israel through film, and which in and of itself really addressed the epistemic issue, because of course Orientalism and different lenses, whose lens, who is in the frame, who is outside the frame, all those questions. And watched the film called Tantura, which is about horrific massacre that happened during the Nakba in the village of Tantura, and how and you see in the film very clearly the relationship between power and knowledge. So this particular film tells the story of how at the time, young master students exposed the story of the massacres that happened during the Nakba in Tantura, and how he was shut down and destroyed. And so you see really the kind of the repression of the knowledge. And we combined it also with reading about the declassification of documents, of archives, and reclassification of documents about the Nakba, about what happened in the Nakba. So it's an opportunity for the students to reflect on power and knowledge, whose story gets to be told, whose story doesn't get to be told. But on top of it, we also read and engaged with the fact that, and this is very relevant for the moment, we read a piece by Nadia Abul-Haj that talks about this all, and the fact that, maybe Said was right to talk about the permission to narrate, and if only Palestinians will have the permission to narrate, then the world will see and will react, and things will change. And of course, we had genocide live stream, and nothing changed. But the point is that she's reflecting on, well, maybe the opposite of forgetting is not remembering, but justice. And that is so yeah, it's important to because this kind of like understanding of like, this notion of some lives is grievable, some lives is ungrievable, a la Butler. This really is emerging in those conversations for the students. So as a teacher, I think that as teachers, we can illuminate ways, this, I mean, again, there is kind of like this naive, like Nadia Abul-Haj is kind of challenging Said with this like naivete that if only people will see the truth, things will change. And it's not clear that this is the case. So it's a hard moment.
Yeah.
For evidence, yes. Yeah.
No, I actually appreciate that. And I think that it's an opportunity to talk about the ways, I think you did a great job visually showing some of the ways that activists are reclaiming Jewish holidays and traditions and re-narrating them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to your point precisely that it's not enough to, like what actually provides transformational knowledge. And in your book, Days of Awe, you talk about this idea of prophetic pastiche, which when I read it,
You
I
warned me that you would ask.
and I'll just back and say, like, when I first read that term, as someone who works in biblical studies and works on an awkward little prophetic book in its own way,
Yeah.
I was like, obviously, like, prophetic literature was always pastiche,
Yeah.
right? So that's like a really, really ancient tradition.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering if you might say a little bit more about what you mean by that turn of phrase in the book, and how the prophetic tradition is understood and being engaged by these activists
Yeah.
you worked with.
Yeah, thank you. You're, I think, the first who asked me about that. Yeah. I mean, that part of the book, yeah, which is, yeah. So, one way in which the prophetic comes in is in the activists, the people who populate the movement, which of course is not, it's again, it's across the spectrum. Like I didn't, belabor with all the, like, the statistics of, how many people from this denomination and how many people from that denomination and how many people would identify themselves as non-Zionists and how many anti-Zionists and how many, and so there is a whole spectrum that I was very intentional to get kind of a slice. But often in the activist spaces, in the way they talk about themselves and their, even this name, if not now, and the logo of, thinking of themselves, oh, we are the generation that is going to really liberate, the enslaved generation, enslaved in, to their own kind of, to those ideological formations, the idolatry or whatnot, still enslaved to Europe, the logic of Europe. And so there is a real sense of, we are somehow extraordinary in leading, and we are young, and so there is also a lot of internal contestation of, with elders, and because with all due respect, 2000. I mean, there is a long history of Jewish activism and also anti-Zionist Jewish activism, also in the U.S. before 2008 or 2014 or 2023. And but there is a sense that what they do is reclaiming the prophetic, that they speak truth to power, that they speak truth to their elders, to the institutions, to IPAC, to and they do that through, like, oh, you taught us those values, but how are you owning up to those values? You taught us to be, for human rights and, progressive. And of course, there is this notion, this category of progressive, except for Palestine. And so you challenge your elders and you're being prophetic in this respect. And then in, as I said, the protest space is often mobilized kind of Jewish repertoire. And so you would hear people, draw on the different traditions, but there is also a lot of interrogation of how the civil rights movement has become, or the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement has become domesticated in Jewish establishment. So there is a critique of that. Of like, okay, it's tired. It's a tired kind of discourse that is domesticated, and so there is that, and we are better because we go deeper into our sources, and another ways in which I kind of connect, other ways that are connected, in which I kind of I was thinking about the prophetic in reference to the movement, is in that it's really, I mean, it really kind of it became very clear that it's not like there is no like a prophet here. The prophetic is in the context of the mobilization, the mass mobilization. This is the prophetic. It's not like some leader over and against a movement. There is nothing unique about that, but I mean, because I think all movements are, all social movements are not, the leaders, but the organizers. But part of what it really kind of it's really embodied in the sense of creating a new community, a prefigurative community. So I didn't get to. I mean, the book goes. Really dedicates some time to looking at what kind of another Jewishness is being reimagined. So not only looking at the Protestant mobilization, but also the formation of new communities. Like I especially look at Tzedek Chicago, a community that defined itself initially as non-Zionist and then eventually as anti-Zionist after a process of discernment, deliberation, and really interrogating this. So yeah, there is a sense of the prophetic coming in as we are speaking truth, but also in the sense of creating this new community through protest, through the protest that is always, relational and intersectional, which is really important.
Yeah, and for, this is going to be maybe a little big question. This will be my last question, and we open it up to people, but I think an opportunity to bridge a little bit with what you said, because I think part of what you show there is a bridge with your more recent book, this sort of interest in decolonizing as a way of forming new kinds of communities, but also in your new book, I think you sort of show how often religion and what you call there the prophetic light gets mobilized in peace building efforts in a way that can quash projects of decolonizing religion. And I bring that up because you mentioned how when you got the book, you just, in July of 2023, you just didn't even want to look at it at that point. And I wonder if you might be able to speak to both that feeling you had and where these activists are now. What are their hopes for decolonizing religion, and how are they feeling right now in this moment?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really terrifying moment right now. I mean, so many of, the Jewish, especially young Jews who mobilized for Palestine are now in the context of the United States, which is my primary context for this book. That involved a lot of the kind of the work of decoloniality in the sense of, thinking about whiteness, thinking about Ashkenazi normativity, thinking about the intersection of struggles, and really in terms of the intersection of struggle, one aspect of the book. I mean, I kind of alluded to it, but it's important because it goes to the decolonial dimension. It became very clear that, especially in the context of Black Lives Matter and their platform, and the platform that explicitly talked about Palestine. And of course, there is a long Black Palestinian solidarity, and that connects to the anti-colonial struggles, is that if they wanted to be, I mean, they really, really wanted to be a part of the anti-racism struggle in the US, George Floyd, et cetera, and in the sense that they needed to choose, to make that moral choice. Like, you cannot be that and support Israel, Israeli policies of apartheid and settler colonialism. And so, this, this was very clear. But what we see now is moment where, as I said, after every assault on Gaza, you have kind of an increase of, Jewish critics of Israeli policies, of Zionism. Again, it's along a spectrum, and there were many Jews populate the pro-Palestine solidarity space and don't, and say, not in my name, never again to anyone, all this. But everybody feels crushed right now. And beyond that, it became very clear that Israel and allies itself with white Christian nationalists. I mean, there is a moment of even added clarity. I mean, 2016, after the elections of the first Trump administration, it became very clear. In fact, that there was a conference of Jewish Voice for Peace immediately after the elections in early 2017 that I talk about in the book, that its slogan, its framing was, we fight white supremacy here and there. So all of a sudden, it was kind of a moment of clarity because, I mean, there were like, card-carrying anti-Semites in the administration, still are. I mean, it's clear, that, Jews are not safer. Even, and also there is a moment of clarity that, Zionism and anti-Semitism go hand in hand very well with people like Orban. But now, even more so, we see very, great clarity on how more and more Israel and Zionists needed to, basically to form coalition with white supremacy. And so another important moment was the Charlottesville, where you had someone like, Richard Spencer, the alt-right talks about, and of course, one of the slogans of in Charlottesville was Jews will not replace us. So it was very clear that white supremacy, white nationalism, white Christian nationalism goes hand in hand with anti-Semitism. But that was not acceptable. That was not acceptable. Of course, Trump said, there are good people on both sides, but that was kind of not because you saw it with such clarity. Oh, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and anti-Semitism. But then you have October 7th, and you have the weaponization of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So, for instance, and you see those forces, capitalizing on that. So we have, the framework of the current administration is Project 2025 that existed before October 7th. And then on the anniversary of October 7th, the first anniversary of October 7th, they come out from the same place, the Heritage Foundation, with Project Esther, which of course plays on, the story of Esther, who, saved the Jews, Persia, together with her uncle. But the document that is deeply Islamophobic, that talks about pro-Palestine activism as a part of the Hamas network, and that includes also, and it explicitly say Jewish Voice for Peace and all those like Jewish, that they are somehow gullible, idiots who participate in this. And he talks about the need to not only to really kind of combine the anti-terrorism methodologies that were built over 20 years of the so-called war on terrorism with this weaponization of anti-Semitism. And all of a sudden you have an alliance that is acceptable, because through the weaponization of anti-Semitism, that is not like the white nationalists, the alt-right and anti-Semitism. Now you have this kind of like twist, this perfect storm. And so many people in the movement who are, Jews, and so here's a document that the project essay is a document written by non-Jews about saving Jews, and presumably, but of course, it's not about saving Jews, it's about saving white supremacy. And so there is a clear analysis of this and kind of despair, general despair. But people continue. I mean, it's not going to crash. People just find different ways of resistance. And clearly part of why the resistance, the repression is so strong is because of the loss of the narrative. So it goes back to the issue of kind of the epistemic, the epistemic dimensions, because if you are so strong and grounded in the narrative, you don't need to repress and censor people so much.
Thank you. I think that's actually a really strong point. I'm not the audience for questions. If people have them, I can take them.
Take that statement.
Yeah.
You want me to do the alternate?
I can do it. You're not right. You've got
We do have 3 questions online.
Yeah, okay.
But we can start.
All right.
Hi, Dr. Omer. I remember reading your book, Decolonizing Disbelief in Religion, and since you brought it about the colonial project, one takeaway that I remember from that book is that increased religious engagement does not necessarily translate into deeper religious literacy or critical understanding, given that the ongoing colonial projects still happening in this post-colonial society. So I'm wondering, how do you see this increased religion engagement with this unlearning process within the Jewish community in American society, different than those of religious engagement that is happening in the post-colonial society?
So what was referred to is in the book Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building. As I mentioned, I offer it's a critical engagement with the instrumentalization of religion, exactly at the intersection of neoliberalism and securitization. So it's also very much driven by the so-called war on terror, and it's a securitizing discourse. And so, but it's very connected to the case of Palestine, Israel, and the ways in which, especially in the ways in which a whole industry, in fact, in the whole industry of religion and peace building was developed over the years, a whole industry of people-to-people engagement and various initiatives like that often do not, or interfaith gatherings and dialogues that often don't address power, don't address violence, definitely don't address like epistemic and structural and symbolic forms of violence as they affect the situation on the ground. So so it's not like I would not make binary distinctions, but a through line, a motif is that often if you extract religion from thinking about conflict transformation or peace building, either as yet another form of currency, this is where it intersects with neoliberalism too, that somehow it's a capital that you kind of can mobilize and either contain or mobilize, something that you need to contain the bad stuff and mobilize the good stuff. It becomes depoliticized, it becomes ahistorical. One starts kind of like one start engaging in a discourse of authenticity that again is depoliticizing, and it really is interesting because Palestine, Israel is one of the so-called laboratories for for peace building, for religion and peace building, because it's the way it is even framed as if religion is somehow a cause, which is exactly what the decolonial critique illuminate, that it's not. It's not a cause. It's not a cause. I mean, that would be reductive to begin with, but in fact, if you understand the context, you see how it's the context of what is happening in Palestine and Israel now. The cause is not, religion. It's settler colonialism. It's settler colonial violence. And within that context, you need to understand, how, for instance, how and why politicians and even in the broader community, the broader social discourse, how come the story of Amalek is deployed? So the archetypal enemy of Israel, that presumably there is like a genocide commandment against Amalek to wipe it out, and then it's operationalized in the current moment very ubiquitously. Like it's really so there is a so if you don't understand it within kind of through multivariable analysis of how come Amalek discourse became so ubiquitous, what are the roots, how did it happen, how to understand it comparatively, the fact that the discourse of Amalek was used also in Manifest Destiny, and this is where it also connects to really interrogating like the Judeo-Christian and what is the Judeo-Christian and how. So this is just to say that any kind of a simplistic work on religion will not, will not get really to the necessary critique. But one cannot stay only in critique because, that can be, just. I mean, it's also a form of privilege, actually, to only stay in critique. And so this is where I really want to think constructively about the caretaking aspect, critical caretaking, because to just be in like kind of endless critique, you can transform the conditions of reality and cannot imagine the possibility of a different future, which I think has to be there. But the key point of connection, to respond to your question, is that in both contexts, religion is deployed in ways that can be deeply depoliticizing. And also make the situation ahistorical.
There are three questions. First one, has the process of unlearning been the same for Israeli Jews and Jews in the diaspora, especially American Jews?
But I'm glad you didn't ask me all three questions. No, I mean, it's a different process, absolutely, yeah. And actually, I conclude the book, Days of Our Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, and I'm very, like, throughout the book, I situate myself, like, I was asked here that I'm Jewish Israeli, and there are different kind of issues and also resources that Jewish Israelis, Jews in Palestine, Israel would need to draw on, and especially for the process of the constructive process of reimagining what it means to be in the space and not be, dominating and oppressor. So I end the book Days of All with the question about, just with an observation about how a lot of what I trace in terms of my interlocutors, the American Jews, is that they constantly disrupt binaries, and that also goes to how the process of politicization on questions of gender and feminism as part. Many in the movement are arrived to the movement through that particular mechanism, and so. But there is one binary that is not disrupted, and that is the one of diaspora versus Zion or Israel. And so you have a lot of kind of reclaiming of like I mentioned before, diasporism, different traditions of diasporist Judaism, including secular traditions of diasporism, and as a way of countering, Israel, countering Zionism as some sort of like a perversion in Jewish history, that it can be understood contextually and so forth, but some form of perversion, and the process of unlearning for Jews in Israel and in Palestine, Israel, and of course it depends which, but we're talking about. But lately, in recent years, I've been looking at people who emerged from the context from the religious Zionist educational framework, because in Jewish Israeli society we have different educational tracks, and one of them is religious Zionism, which is very strong and has gotten stronger in recent decades, and I've been engaging in kind of deep interviews with people who are emerging with a lot of literacy. They actually understand that they know the tradition much better than secular Jewish Israelis who only know the Bible, which means they are illiterate in terms of the tradition, really. I mean, and this is in the secular educational framework, you only learn the Bible, and you read it as a land entitlement, as a history book. And so I've been tracing people who are involved with a movement called the Faithful Left, but it has different kind of offshoots, and they have kind of depth in the tradition, and they engage in, and they ask questions too, especially if they end up doing military service, and they also undergo a process of unlearning, because things don't compute, especially if you go all over Gaza and write horrific graffitis of revenge on destroyed homes, and all of sudden things don't really compute with what you learn in terms of the traditions. People are starting to ask questions, and then one very interesting process that I've been people engage in the process that I've been a part of is sitting together in a very Jewish way, reading texts from the land, from Palestine, but from the 16th century, 17th century, people who were sitting in the land and writing and thinking, including about the sacredness, but from a different kind of a different perspective that is not Eurocentric, that is not. And so they do a lot of just learning from the what they call Aron Asfarim HaYehudi, the Jewish book cabinet, and then have conversations like that really resonate with Jewish hermeneutical praxis of reading and thinking and talking and discussing and interrogating and thinking together across generations, across histories, across geographies, and then go and learn about the conflict and do protective presence, like in Masafayata or in Lod, and really do to learn about the occupation, learn about apartheid, and so this is one form of unlearning that connects to kind of the also reimagining what it means to be, potentially reimagining what it means to be Jewish in the space. The other kind of other sectors who I mean, really in one way or another, really are able to see Palestinians, which is not, it's less and less, as I said, I mean, there are so many walls and so few opportunities to actually communicate that than even in my generation when I was growing up. I mean, it's so the only time you communicate and you see is when you are part of a military, which is but you do have a whole, for instance, breaking the silence, veterans who, again, things don't compute for them because they are taught, they all reach kind of like a breaking point where they think of themselves, they can't sustain cognitive dissonance anymore of their civilian, so-called civilian self and the military self, what they are doing as part of the occupation. But in the context of Jewish Israeli society, the mechanisms are so strong to maintain the cognitive dissonance. So powerful. And so, I mean, which really explains why the so-called Trump plan for ethnically cleansing Gaza is supported by over 80% in the last poll that I saw from a couple of days ago. 80% of Jewish Israeli community society supports to ethnically cleanse 2 million people after genociding them. So this is, so at the moment, even like thinking about like unlearning and reimagining feels like really not adequate at all of a conversation. But I've been trying to trace this process.
Well, Zionism, political Zionism has always been a settler colonial movement from the time it was founded in the 1890s. And when it came time to found the state of Israel in 1948, it was no less settler colonialist, but at the time it wrapped itself in a cloak in the post-World War II environment. Framing itself as being a state that would recognize tolerance, that was going to be a liberal democracy, that even pretended to socialism. And what's happened is since 1948, that cloak has slipped off. Mechanics use a tool called a ratchet wrench, where you can set up no matter how you really handle the thing that you're tightening or loosening always moves in the same direction. And that's the history of Israel since 1948 is each year Israel clicks another couple of clicks to the right. Each year, each government is more militarized, more fanatically Zionist, more violent, more racist, more fascistic than the year before. And when we get to the time period after October 7th, nothing has changed about the direction, but the velocity at which it's changing is remarkable. The pace has really picked up. You wrote in 2015 about the thinking of the Israeli peace camp. Is it really correct to think that there's, in any significant sense, an Israeli peace camp that exists today?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I first want to say just have a few reflections on what you said, and then I'll respond to the question about the Israeli peace camp. Yes, it's important to bring the settler colonial frame to understand, especially from a Palestinian perspective. If you just look at the map from 1917 to today, I mean, it's a very clear map in terms of if settler colonialism is about maximizing land and minimizing natives on the land, indigenous people, then, this is what, and of course, Zionism as a political movement to create, Jewish majority, Jewish democracy. I think what the narrative that you suggested is how really what we see now is the solving the contradictions between the two terms of Jewish and democratic, but also it entailed Zionism as a project entailed creating demographic realities that necessitated Nakba, necessitated depopulation. And also the settler colonial frame is about the elimination of the natives, to refer to Patrick Wolf's thesis, but others. But it doesn't necessarily immediately would come in a form of genocide. I mean, it can also be through inclusion, right? It's through liberalism is another mechanism of that. I mean, liberalism is the other side. This is what decoloniality teaches us, that modernity, that colonialities and modernity come hand in hand. And so there is this notion of the coloniality as the modernity, coloniality is one and the same, constitutive of one another. But it is important to note, like in the kind of the story that you told, you talked about Zionism and the Israeli government and this and that, which is very important to talk about agency of the people and what they are doing. But it's also important to note that, I mean, and this is how I always teach my classes on Palestine, Israel, and talk about the role of imperial patrons, as Rashid Khalili talks about it. You can understand the history, you can understand this trajectory without the patrons, the imperial, and so 1917, Balfour, and we can understand the escalation that has been happening in the past 16 months with the US and Germany and whatnot. So I think that this is, I mean, it's very critical not to bracket that from the analysis. Which then leads me to thinking about the peace camps. So the peace camp, I mean, one of the key conclusions from my first book, which is based on my dissertation, and now when I read, I don't want to read it because, like, I've changed, I deepened my understanding. But one of the key conclusion is that, again, there's no, like, the peace movement in Israel did not really interrogate the Nakba. So everything is, the framework for peace, thinking about peace is 67, which of course the reality is on the ground right now. I mean, the green line is completely eroded. So the 67, and has been for a long time. In 2018, the Knesset ratified the Jewish nation state law, that says that Israel is a state for Jews and Jews only. And in fact, it didn't use the word state, it used the land. Very important, the land of Israel, not the state of Israel. So this is to connect to you, to your point about the kind of the settler colonial progression and the becoming, kind of coming to term, really solving the contradictions by becoming Jewish and not democratic. And of course, right before October 7th, we had the democracy protests that were very real, in many respects, very impressive. But just looking at the visuals of those protests with really oceans of Israeli flag, and you didn't have, first of all, like, what democracy are you talking about? There are millions of people whose lives depend on, completely depends on Israel's decision, who are not voting for the government, but also you didn't see in that space anyone making connection to the occupation, for example, very few. people kind of on the margins that talk about there is no democracy with occupation. And also, interestingly, and this is where kind of it's important to not be binary, because one interesting case during the in the moment of when the Jewish nation state law passed, or it was in the process of passing, there was a lawsuit against the Knesset that was advanced by a new collective called the Civic Mizrahi Collective that went to the highest court, to the high court, in really challenging the law, the Jewish nation state law, for its demotion of Arabic. Because guess what? Arabic is also a Jewish language. Of course, they lost, but it was a very important moment. And I think that it has great potentiality there. And this is where, Arab Jews, critical Mizrahi work, and there is a lot of scholarship, like I mentioned a little bit, of some key names in it, in that space. But like the Mizrahi Civic Collective said, we are not here, we don't want to mobilize to for keep the good old democracy, because it wasn't there also for us. And they draw on their connection. Mizrahiness not as an identity, it's not identity politics, it's about a lens, a prism through which to look at the space, and also about Jews in the space, again, Jews in the space. And yes, we claim Arabic as a Jewish language. Yes, understand the interconnection between Mizrahi marginalization and Palestinian oppression. They're not the same. And especially now, generations later, where Mizrahi became assimilated into the settler colonial frame. But there are resources there to work with. So this is to highlight that a lot of the peace movement in Israel has been very Ashkenazi. And there need to be, and this is something that I already highlighted in my first book, but that analysis only deepened. And this also true for the fact that, there is a long mobilization, anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist mobilization as part of the communist, the story of the communist movement in Palestine before even the state, that always saw kind of the geography, first of all, saw Zionism as a tool of imperialist, and was always Jewish and not Jewish. And so the entire space as, the space for kind of emancipatory politics. But then over time, what you see is really reflective of, even if in this communist or non-Zionist left or independent left, it's also called independent left, is that you see mirroring the fragmentation of the geography. So it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller kind of project. And there was kind of like a moment of real kind of great mobilization in the 80s during the first Intifada, and of Jewish activists who formed coalition and did all kind of committees with Berzet, and it was kind of a very exhilarating moment, but still it was within that. You see the constraints of that kind of in a sense, the colonial geography, and how it fragmented different Palestinian geographies. And so, so it's not a good situation right now, but there are still there is incredible work that is done in terms of actual relationships that are being built on the ground, but people don't get a chance because there is such impunity. The kind of, so for instance, Masafa Yatta, which is an area where that you have many Jewish activists, Jewish Israeli activists, partly because they can go there, because it's Area C, according to kind of the Oslo framework. And the relationships that are built are so meaningful between the communities and over years. I mean, it's really, I mean, the American Jews come in and out. But the Jewish Israelis are always there, and more so. And but it feels like kind of like a triage. Because the situation is of such despair and disappearance. I mean that, but there is so much role here for the United States, and in facilitating conditions that will have less, that will even give a chance to other kind of political formations to take place. But not, I mean, some people don't have another passport, so and they're trying to work, to figure out, and also work on, questions about return. What would understanding that the right of return of Palestinians is key for thinking about questions of justice. So there is a lot of conversation in some spaces about, let's not think about it as zero sum, that somehow the right of return for Palestinians is means genocide, which is like how it's heard in most other contexts. And so there are conversations and a lot of like political education on the Nakba, the event, but the ongoing, and but there is a very little chance of this at the moment, coming into becoming a political force.
So, thank you so much for this. I realized that time and so, please join me again. That's to the event.